Hey y'all, so I am back with a new build video. I just finished up my Senshi cosplay from Dungeon Meshi, and I'm excited to show you exactly how I made it. We made this almost entirely by hand using EVA foam. And he moves! That's right, he's animatronic. So many of you reached out to me on my socials wanting a tutorial, and thankfully I recorded most of it. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I made it, but if you'd like to make your own, my patterns are all available on my Discord. You see, instead of using Patreon, I'm using Discord subscriptions, and my members get access to all of my patterns there. There's a ton of free resources, including materials, guides, coupons, and a cosplay help channel. So pause this video, click the link in the description, and after you've joined, let's dive right on in. So my first step in making any cosplay is thinking about how it's going to actually look on me. I start by taking a photo of myself, posing like the character, and holding something for scale. Then I compare that photo to the character's artwork and break down all the details. One way to check proportions is by comparing the size of the body to its head. For example, Senshi is around 3.5 heads tall while crouching, and I'm around 5 heads tall. That's a big difference. If I followed my own measurements exactly, my head would just look too small. So I'm gonna go bigger, but not too big. I'm gonna aim for around 4 heads tall, a middle ground. So once I figured out the scale and measurements for the helmet, I scaled up a front and a side view of the design and printed them out. These are great for tracing and measuring and just making sure that the build matches the original design without having to compare it to a screen. Next, I needed a base to work off of. And you can get creative with what you have, but I wound up just wrapping my mannequin head in grocery bags and duct tape until it matched the size of my references. And once you have that cobbled together, we can start building our first pattern, and that should be the crown of the helmet, the top. And for that, I like to use what I call the banana peel method. And the best way to explain that is imagine you're trying to pattern out a banana. The easiest way to do that would be to use the peel to capture the banana's 3D shape and lay it out as 2D pieces. So we're going to do the same by wrapping our shape in aluminum foil and securing it down with duct tape. Then we can use a Sharpie to outline the seams and mark everything so you know where each piece is going to attach. Now there's a bit of an art to drawing these lines, but the goal is to have as few pieces as possible that can still lay flat. Well, it took me a couple tries to get it right, so don't worry if it's not perfect on the first go. You can always tape it back up or start over. It's no problem at all. But once you're happy with the shape, I like to transfer the pattern to cardstock. And this gives me an opportunity to clean up the curves and cut out the registration marks, which is going to make it easier when I need to transfer this to foam. You can even tape these cardstock pieces together to check the shape before cutting the foam. And that's actually saved me a lot of material in the past, so it's something I tend to always do. But if you're in a rush, you can skip the cardstock and just use the foil and tape. Okay, so now that we have our pattern, let's start building. We're going to be using EVA foam, which is awesome for cosplay because it's lightweight, it's flexible, and more importantly, it is tough. And you can shape it into just about anything with just a few basic tools. A blade, a heat gun, a rotary tool, and some contact cement. For this build, I'm going to be using HD foam from SKS Props, and since we want this helmet to be nice and sturdy, we're going to go with the thick 10mm foam. Start by tracing each pattern piece twice, flipping them over for the other side of the helmet. And don't forget the registration marks. Those little lines are super important to line everything up later. After tracing, it is time to cut. I'm using a utility knife with a fresh snap-off blade. Sharp blades make cleaner cuts. Next up is gluing. For EVA foam, contact cement works best because it sticks instantly once the two pieces touch. Apply it to both sides, let it dry for a few minutes until it's not shiny anymore, then press the pieces together and they'll bond right away. Now you can really see the shape starting to take form. With this method, you can build pretty much anything you can dream up. And we've got plenty more to build, so let's keep going. Alright, let's pattern out the bottom half of the helmet. I placed the completed dome back onto the head form and started measuring out the base of the helmet using our references. We're using the same method as before, but this part needs a bit more structure. So I pre-cut out a strip of foil, and then I wrapped that around the base of the helmet. Then I pinned in some scrap foam to act as a scaffolding for it, and that helped me get the shape just right. Now, I noticed that the base of the helmet kind of flares out a bit, so to achieve that, I rolled up some foam and taped it along the bottom edge. And after a bit of adjusting and trial and error, we finally nailed the shape. Now it's time for that banana peel method again. We're gonna wrap it, tape it, mark it, and peel it off. After transferring it to cardstock, I wasn't really happy with how it was flaring out, so I made a few adjustments to the pattern by hand. This is where paper prototyping can really come in handy. Not only does it save foam, but it gives you a chance to tweak things before cutting. Now from here, you know the drill. Cut, glue, assemble. And there we go. The base is all done. Now let's add the brim to our helmet. For this part, we're going to use a strip of 6mm foam that's around 1.5 inches wide and about 1 yard long. Since the brim needs to sit at an angle, we're going to cut one side of that strip at a 45-degree angle. Next, we're going to want that strip to have a curve to it, and the easiest way to do this is to apply some heat and gently stretch it out while it's warm. Now, you don't need to stretch it too much, just enough to help it bend easily when we glue it to the helmet. Foam is naturally flexible, so this just makes it a little easier to work with. Before we glue it on, we're also going to add those cutout details that Cinchi has before we glue it on. It's just going to be a lot easier if we do it now. I used a hole punch for the smaller hole because it was the right size, and the larger one I cut out by hand. The edges are going to look a little rough right now, but we're going to clean those up later with our rotary tool, so no need to stress out about that. Now, it's time to glue. This step can be a little tricky, so don't rush it. Be careful not to stretch the foam out too much. You'll probably also notice that the strip is going to be longer than what you need, and that's totally fine. We're doing that on purpose. After you glue it on, you can trim off the extra foam and then glue the ends together for a nice clean fit. And there you go. The brim's done. Okay, so next up, let's add the crest. Now, there's nothing too fancy here, so why don't we just speed through this one. Foil, tape, banana peel method. Trace the pattern, cut it out, transfer to foam, glue, and assemble. Now, there's a lot of different ways to make horns. One of the easiest is to actually sculpt them out of foam clay, but the tricky part there is getting them to look symmetrical. So personally, I prefer to pattern them out. So we'll start by, you guessed it, sculpting the horn shape out of aluminum foil and then using that banana peel method. So you'll notice on Cinchi's horns that it's made up of these individual segments, and we might as well just use those as our seam lines, and the end result is a series of concentric rings that we're gonna glue together. Throughout the anime, his horns are actually drawn pretty inconsistently. This is actually pretty common when translating designs from anime, so feel free to pick a shape that you like best, and don't worry if yours don't look exactly like mine. So for the construction, I'm using 2mm foam, and the result is super lightweight, which is exactly what we want for our helmet. Before we attach the horns, let's clean up our seams and add some texture to the helmet. So my seams here are actually pretty rough. When I first started working with foam, I would spend a ton of time just trying to get perfect seams. But that often just led to me wasting a lot of foam because a lot can go wrong during the gluing process. And foam also just has a subtle texture to it that when you've worked with it a lot really kind of stands out. So I've always just preferred adding my own. And that actually has the added benefit of covering up all of those mistakes. And experimenting with finishes is a really fun way to make your build stand out and look unique. And since Cinchi is not really even known for taking good care of his gear, I decided to just really rough up this helmet. To do this, first I leveled down all the seams, and then I created a rough brushed texture that followed the contours of the prop. Now, a quick safety note, when you're dremeling foam, you're going to want to wear a face mask or use a shop vac to manage all those dust particles. Seriously, you do not want to be breathing those in. So in addition to texturing, I also took the time to soften up and clean all the edges of the foam. This is something that a lot of new cosplayers skip, and it makes a big difference. You see, most things don't have sharp edges, so rounding them off can really improve the look. All right, so next up, it's time to work on that weld mark. Now, this part is a little controversial because a lot of people will interpret this mark as battle damage or like a cut. And well, you learn in the story that a repair was done here. So I like to interpret this as a welding mark. And my cosplay, my rules. So to do this, I used the original reference to cut out the weld shape out of 10mm foam. Then I rounded it out and added some texture to give it a little bit more dimension. Next, we're going to need to make room for it by cutting into the brim. So after marking the spot, I used my Dremel to carefully dig into the foam. I took my time here because I didn't want to remove too much, just enough for a snug fit. With a little glue, our weld mark is in place and good to go. Okay, let's get back to those horns because we forgot one important detail. There's actually a metal socket at the base of the horn. Now this part is actually pretty simple. We're just gonna cut out a 1/2 strip of 2mm foam. We're gonna wrap it around the base of the horn and then trim off any excess. Then you can sand it down for that clean look. A few years ago, I made a horned helmet that was an absolute nightmare to travel with. So this time I wanted to make sure that these horns were detachable. For that, I'm gonna go with a friction fit, knowing that I can always add magnets or screws later on. So to do that, all we gotta do is to create a socket for these horns to plug into. I've cut a 3-inch diameter piece of 10mm foam, and then I glued it onto the helmet and it made for a snug fit. But if yours is too loose, you can always add in some hot glue inside the horn, and if it's too tight, just Dremel it down until it fits perfectly. So at this point, the helmet was pretty much done, but I had some concerns. So since she has a pretty wide face, and mine was looking pretty narrow, so I decided to do a little bit of surgery on it, and I cut out 1 inch from the base. Now, you know, not everything always goes according to plan, and one of the fun things about making your own cosplay is figuring out these little challenges that crop up along the way. I also noticed that the chin of the helmet wasn't really sticking out the way that I wanted it to, so a good trick to help foam keep its shape is adding a strip of foam along the inside. This extra piece creates tension that holds the shape in place. Just make sure the pattern matches the shape you want and double check that your registration marks line up perfectly. All right, now for the fun part. Let's make Senchi's face. First, we'll pattern out the area of the helmet that we're going to fill using our trusty foil and tape method. Once we have the shape, we'll use cutouts from our face reference to mark the shadow, the nose, and the eyes. Then we'll transfer everything to cardstock, making sure to add an edge allowance so that we can attach it later. To make sure that we can see, we'll use black plastic mesh as the base, using the shadowed part of the helm as a visor. I'll be able to see out, but nobody's going to be able to see in. Next, we'll cut out the face using 2mm foam and then glue it onto the mesh, sanding down the visible edges for a smooth finish. Then we'll cut away a section of the pattern to mark where the nose will go. Now, constructing the nose was the part that I was the most nervous about when I decided to make this cosplay. It's a pretty complex shape, but I found that trusting in the process always helps. I didn't want to overcomplicate it, so I decided to just make the nose out of a single piece of 2mm foam and then heat form it. After gluing down the top, I used heat and a clay smoothing tool to stretch and round out the tip of the nose and the nostrils. I was so happy with the result. It turned out way better than I expected, and it was surprisingly simple to make. All right, let's make the mustache. So I made Senchi's beard using some leftover faux fur that I had, so we'll use the same material for this. But since that fur is going to add a bit of thickness, we're going to size down the pattern a bit before cutting out a base shape using EVA foam. The foam's not going to be seen, so I just quickly rounded out the edges using my utility knife and some scissors. After that, I cut out a square from the fur and I wrapped it around the foam using some hot glue. You can style faux fur just like you would a wig, and that means using some Got2b glued hairspray. Now, I was actually out of Got2b at the time, so I used some hair gel that I had as a temporary fix. Got2b is definitely going to give you a better hold, so you should definitely use that. Once I was happy with this shape, I trimmed off some stray hairs, and that mustache was good to go. All right, time to get ready to paint. The first thing you're going to want to do is to fill in and hide any details you don't want to be seen. This usually means filling in your seams. Now, we've already hidden most of our seams with that texture that we put in, but we can still use a filler to soften things up and make it look like one solid piece of metal. For this, we're going to use an acrylic paintable caulk. Quick Seal here works great. It goes on thick, but you can thin it and smooth it out with water. Now, I like to use my fingers for this, though one quick safety note, I really probably should be using gloves here, as the caulk can really dry out and irritate your skin. So once you put on those gloves, you can use your finger like a squeegee and wipe away any extra caulk. The goal here is to have the white caulk filling in the deeper crevices while the gray foam peeks out on the surface. Make sure to also run some caulk all along the edges, as this is going to give the helmet a clean, welded together look with no visible crevices. So once we're done filling everything, we need to prime the foam for painting. Priming is actually a really important step because it seals up the foam and keeps the paint from soaking in and cracking over time. For this project, we're going to be using Flex Bond, although Mod Podge can work well too if you're looking for a less expensive option. Both of them are water-based glues that create a smooth, paintable surface on foam. I like to add a little bit of water to this primer, and I apply it in 2 or 3 coats for an even coverage. Now, don't forget to prime the horns as well, because once that's done, our helmet and our horns are going to be ready to paint. So for a steel finish, my go-to is this premium fluid acrylic and iridescent silver. You'll want the one in the bottle, not the one in the tube, because it's already thinned out to reduce brush strokes. It does take a few coats to get full coverage, but it's totally worth it. The iridescent finish really makes the foam look like metal. For the horns though, that's when we're going to reach for that cheap stuff. I love using matte craft paints for cosplay because they save you a ton of money, and controversial opinion, I think it's going to make your cosplay look better. Glossier satin paints can highlight mistakes and can look blown out in a bright light, like a camera flash. And if you really want a shiny finish, you can always add a top coat later. My painting style is all about layering. I started with a light sandy brown for the base, and then I applied a black wash, which is basically a watered down black paint that you quickly wipe away after brushing it on. After that, I layered in more sandy brown, gradually building up to a subtle tortoiseshell effect. I used the same technique for the metal. I added a black wash, wiped it away, and then dry brushed in more silver back in to bring out all those highlights. This, along with our texture, gave it a worn dwarven steel look. And then to finish it off, I just added some thin layers of white paint just to lighten up that weld mark. Layering is key here. Don't be afraid to experiment a little bit and build up to a finish that you love. For painting the face, we're going to use the same steps as before, but since it's smooth and doesn't have that texture, we're going to need to be extra careful about our brush strokes. After filling in the nose seams with some caulk, I started layering in some Flex Bond, but this time I watered it down more than usual. Instead of brushing it on, I used a dabbing motion, which creates a slight grainy texture. This is important because skin has pores, and we'll want to emulate that so the surface looks more natural. Now let's talk about putting down the color. Matching your skin tone can be tricky, but it's really important if you want the face to look realistic. I have fair skin, so I used a peachy color as my base. Then I added some pinks to give the face depth and warmth. Since she's got a big old rosy nose, so I also blended in some extra pink there, kind of like I was adding some blush. And if you want to add some freckles, like I did, because I have freckles, here's a fun trick. Water down some brown paint and get your brush just slightly wet. Then flick the brush with your fingers to spray tiny dots of paint across the face. And once those freckles dry, you can also use your lighter base paint to soften things up if it comes out too dark. So all that's left now is attaching the face, the eyes, and mustache to the helmet. Now my Senshi is animatronic, but yours doesn't have to be. Adding electronics definitely increases the difficulty of this build, and it was a huge learning curve for me, and honestly, I'm probably not even the best person to teach that part. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, and I know there's plenty of room for improvement. That being said, here's how I did it. First, I reinforced the back of the face with Warbla to lock in the curve. Warbla is a thermoplastic that softens when heated and hardens as it cools. It's great for adding strength, especially when working with heavy electronics. But the downside, it's kind of expensive. So if you're keeping it simple without motors or wiring, you should probably skip this step. Next up, I worked on the eyes. I used pre-cut acrylic circles and marked where the pupil should go with a template. Then I glued it all together with some E6000. Googly eyes could probably work pretty well here too. For the mustache, I used a servo motor to control the movement. Servos are perfect because they can rotate 180 degrees with precision, which is great for getting that wiggly mustache effect. I cut out rectangles for the motor to sit in and secured everything down with some glue. The eyes needed to move in all directions though, so for that I used stepper motors. Unlike servos, stepper motors can rotate in any direction, but they need to be reset after each use. To help with that, I 3D printed a small key that I glued to the back of the eyes. This let me attach the eyes to the motor and adjust the position at the same time. Finally, I attached the mustache. This part was actually trickier than I expected. I had to set it at just the right angle so that the pieces wouldn't collide with each other when they moved. So for that, I 3D printed a little ramp attachment to get the angle just right and then super glued it all together. Also, be very careful not to get super glue in your servo motor or you're gonna have to rip everything out and replace it. Yeah. But once you have everything connected, then it's just a matter of wiring everything up, giving it some power, and uploading some logic into your board. I wish I could say it was that simple, but for this video, well, we'll just leave it at that. There's obviously so much more that I could share about my cosplay. There's the beard, the skirt, and all of the armor. I even made the belt out of hand-tooled leather, but I'm kind of excited to start working on my next project, so we'll probably revisit that another time. I'd love to create more in-depth videos like this, so if you enjoyed it, please drop a like and a subscribe to let me know that I should make more. I'd also like to say thank you to all of my supporters who help me create videos just like this. All right, that was a lot. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you at the next one.